Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to take a look at my reading goals for 2023 and see how I did. So I really enjoy making this kind of video every January where I take a look at my reading goals from the last year, see how I did on completing them, and also take a look at my reading stats and kind of what the division between different kind of books was in my reading the previous year. So I am going to take you through my reading stats for the year of 2023 first, and then I'm going to have a look at my reading goals and how I did overall. So I had a very good reading year in 2023. I read a lot of things. In fact, I read 167 things. I think Goodreads says I've read 160 things, but there are a couple of standalone short stories I read that I didn't mark on Goodreads, and I also read a few 2024 new releases that aren't on Goodreads yet, that I had proof copies for. So that's why there is a bit of a difference between my Goodreads number and the actual number that I've read. So on average, that's 14 books a month and 3 books a week, which seems like a lot. I should say that doesn't include any books that I read for work. I am an editor, and I do read a lot of books for work, but this is just books that I've read for fun, and I read a lot in 2023, so that's good. So I think in 2022, I read 140 books. So obviously I read quite a lot more in 2023, but I did read a lot more poetry, plays and short stories and short story collections this year. So I probably have read more short things in 2023 than in previous years, although I did also read some very long classics, so maybe it kind of evens out, I don't know. I was trying to work out if this is the most that I have ever read. In 2020, I read 166 books according to Goodreads, which obviously is less than 167, but I can't remember if there were any books that didn't go on to Goodreads in 2020 for whatever reason. So who knows? I probably read a similar amount this year to I did in 2020, which had been the year I'd read the most ever. So, you know, I read a lot in 2023, which I'm happy with. So of the 167 books that I read in 2023, 85 of them were contemporary books and 82 of them were classics. I can't remember exactly where I drew the line for all of these books, but usually I draw the line between classic and contemporary at somewhere around like 1990. I know that's fairly arbitrary, but that is kind of what works for me. So of the 85 contemporary books I read, let's break them down by like what kind of books they were, because that's always interesting to see. So I read 56 novels, 3 short story collections and 3 individual short stories, 11 works of poetry, 6 plays and 6 works of non-fiction. And then also of the 85 contemporary books I read, I'm going to break them down by country because I always think that's quite interesting to look at. So I read 58 books by British authors, 11 books by authors from the USA, 5 books by authors from Japan, 4 books from Ireland, 3 books from Canada, 2 books by authors from Italy, and then 1 book from Sweden, Argentina, Australia, Brunei, Trinidad and Tobago, Ukraine, and 1 from Kenya and Tanzania. That was 1 book that was a short story collection with short stories from authors from both Kenya and Tanzania. And then I also read an individual short story from the Philippines and 2 more individual short stories from the USA. That probably adds up to slightly more than 85 books because if an author like grew up in one country and then moved to another country, I tend to just count them for both. And then of the 82 classics I read in 2023, let's again look at them by kinds of book. So I read 50 novels, 10 short story collections and 4 individual short stories, 5 collections of poetry, 9 plays and 4 works of non-fiction. And then again, let's look at the kind of countries and time periods that I read from. So 54 of the classics I read were British classics, 9 of which were from before the Victorian period, 32 of which were Victorian classics, 12 of which were from 1900 to 1950, and 2 of which were from after that. And then I also read 2 Irish classics, 1 of which was Victorian and 1 Georgian. And I also read 7 classics from the USA, 4 classics from India, 4 classics from Italy, 4 classics from Jamaica, 3 classics from Japan, 1 Brazilian classic, 1 French classic, 1 Norwegian classic. And I also read classic short stories from the USA, the UK, France, Ireland, Russia, New Zealand, Czechia and Argentina. So continuing with my reading stats for 2023, let's have a look at my reading formats. So 81 of the books I read were physical books that I owned, 23 of the books I read were library books or books that I borrowed from friends, 43 of the books I read were on audiobook, and 20 of the books I read were on ebook. So interestingly, I was expecting to have a lot more audiobook reads this year than last year, but actually it's a very, very similar number to last year. I think last year I read 42 audiobooks. I feel like I've read a lot more on audiobook this year, but actually thinking about it, I did read quite a few like 40-hour long Dickens audiobooks this year. I think I must have listened to a lot more hours of audiobooks in 2023 than I did in 2022, even if the number turned out to be quite similar. Then there are a few other statistics that I collected from my 2023 reading. So in 2023, I read quite a lot of new releases. I read 27 books that had come out in 2022, 18 books that had come out in 2023, and 6 books that are due to come out in 2024 that I was reading proof copies of, which means I think like 32% of my reading, nearly a third of my reading was new releases, which is interesting, especially actually considering how many classics I read. That must mean that more than half of my contemporary reading is very new releases, which is interesting. I broke down my reading by gender, so 91 of the books I read were by female authors, so 54%, and 70 books were by male authors, so 42%, and then 6 books were either by non-binary authors or were like anthologies by a mix of authors. I don't think that's too different from last year. I think maybe last year was slightly more dominated by female authors. Then in terms of like where in the world the books I was reading were from, 68% of the books I read were from the UK, and 32% of the books I read were not from the UK, which interestingly is basically the exact same percentage split as last year. And then 19.5 of the books I read were books in translation, the half being for a short story anthology I read where there was a mix of short stories in translation and not. So that's about 12%, which is higher than last year and higher than the year before, but I would still like it to be higher than that. And then 36.5 of the books I read were by authors of colour. I think there's 3.5s in there for short story anthologies that were by various writers. So that's about 22%, which is pretty similar to last year, I think, and probably slightly lower than I would like. And then 25 of the books I read were rereads, which is 15%, which is slightly higher than last year, and probably because of all the Dickens rereading I have been doing in 2023. So those are my stats for 2023. I always find it kind of interesting to look at my stats and kind of see what my breakdown of reading was, I suppose. But yeah, I don't have too much to say about my stats. I feel like they are overall relatively similar to last year. So let's move on to my reading goals for 2023 and talk about how I did. I'll leave down below my initial goals video that I did at the start of 2023 talking about my reading goals for the year, and I'll also have probably later this week or next week a video up with my 2024 reading goals, which I'm excited to make. But for now, let me tell you about my 2023 reading goals and how I did. So I actually had 2 goals for 2023 which were reading related but not strictly about reading. So I'll talk about those 2 first. One was to watch more screen adaptations of books, which I kind of did. I watched a few in 2023. I watched a mini-series of The Moonstone, which was pretty good. I watched a mini-series of Great Expectations, which was not good. I watched a film of The Count of Monte Cristo that was pretty good, and I watched Rational Creatures, which is a modern retelling adaptation of Persuasion, and that was really good too. But those were the only things that I watched this year that were new to me in terms of adaptations, and I probably would like to watch more. And then another big goal I had for 2023 was to redecorate my office / the library, the room that I work and film in, and spend like all my time in. And I did redecorate it. I have done a redecoration vlog / library reorganization vlog, which I'll link down below, and I'm so glad that I redecorated this room. It is now so much nicer. It was interesting as I was editing my like 2023 year in reading a video and seeing like all the clips of how this room used to look. I'm like, oh yes, this room is so much nicer now. It's so much nicer space to be in. And considering I am freelance and self-employed, I work from home and I spend like so many hours a day in this room. It is very nice to have this room nice. That was a big like life goal for 2023, so I'm very glad that I redecorated this room and I'm really pleased with it. So my first reading goal every year is always my Goodreads challenge, which I basically always set at 100 books because I always want to read at least 100 books a year. Usually I read well over that, but that is always my kind of base goal. And I did read well over 100 books this year. Like I said, I read 167 things, and Goodreads thinks I've read 160, so that's pretty good. I'm very happy with that. My next goal I did much less well with, and that was my goals around my physical TBR. So at the beginning of 2023, my physical TBR was at 42 books, and I said I wanted to get it down to 20 books by the end of the year. And I also said that I wanted to try and read nearly everything from my TBR jar, which is this little bucket filled with slips of paper that have on them the names of books from my TBR. And I said I wanted to get down this TBR jar to less than 10 titles in. And I have not done well on my physical TBR this year. So my physical TBR before Christmas stood at 51 books, which is obviously more than 42 and a lot more than 20. I then got 6 books for Christmas, so it's now at 57, which is a lot bigger than I would like my physical TBR to be honest. At one point in the year I did get to 70, and I'm glad it's no longer a 70. I read quite a lot of books from my physical TBR in December, but 57 books is still, for me, far too many to have on my physical TBR. This TBR jar that I wanted to get down to less than 10 books in still has 20 books in. So I have read like half of the books in my physical TBR jar this year, but that's not enough. I feel like my TBR is out of control. I think there are a few reasons for this. I think one is that I got sent a lot more review copies in 2023, and since my novel The Secrets of Hartwood Hall came out, I now get sent review copies like to quote as an author sometimes, which is very exciting. But that means I feel the pressure to read those books faster than if I've been sent them to review them on BookTube, because if you sent them to review on BookTube, then maybe you review them like around when the book comes out. But if you get sent them to quote as an author, then you need to review them like before the print date, which is usually like 2 months before the book comes out. I've read quite a lot of books this year that I got sent for review that I read very quickly, rather than reading books that have been on my TBR for longer. And also because my novel The Secrets of Hartwood Hall came out this year, I feel like I just spent a lot more time in bookshops this year, so I ended up buying a lot more books. So there's that. So I feel like in 2024 I really need to refocus on my physical TBR and try to get it down again. I think maybe the TBR Clear Out Readathon, which I haven't done since 2020, maybe making a return in 2024 if people are up for that, because 57 books feels like way too much for me. I do know that a lot of people have TBRs of like hundreds and hundreds of books. I think basically the way I think about it is that there are two different ways that people generally think about their TBR. Some people view their TBR as a library, and they're just going to pick whichever book they want to read from their library. And some people view their TBR as a to-do list. And I'm definitely someone who views my TBR as a to-do list, and 57 books on my to-do list is too much. And that's not like a sad thing for me. I enjoy to-do lists. I enjoy crossing things off to-do lists. I'm happy for my TBR to be a to-do list, but I would rather it had 20 books on than 57. So, you know, I did not do well in keeping my TBR under control in 2023, and I need to do better in 2024, and I'm going to try to. So there we go. Another goal I had for 2023 was to read more books from my long-term Victorian literature TBR. So at the beginning of 2022, I had a list of 24 Victorian books that I wanted to read over 2022 and 2023. And there were also 4 authors who I wanted to read more by: George Gissing, Wilkie Collins, Anthony Trollope, and Margaret Oliphant. So over the course of 2022 and 2023, I read 14 out of that list of 24. And then I also picked a different book by one of those authors, so I kind of count that as taking that off. And then I did also read more by George Gissing, Wilkie Collins, and Anthony Trollope in 2023, though not by Margaret Oliphant. I have already made a separate video about this, my 2024 and 2025 Victorian literature TBR, where I talk about how I did with the previous 2 years' goals and all the books I want to read in the next 2 years. There are plenty. So, you know, I did mediumly on this goal. I didn't do that well, but I'm kind of relatively happy with it, and I'm happy with my new list for 2024 and 2025. Another ongoing goal of mine that I tend to have every year is to read more diversely, specifically to continue to push myself to read more by writers of colour and to read books by authors from a wider variety of countries. So this is a kind of continuing goal for me that I basically keep on my list every year. And specifically, I said that in 2023 I wanted to read 15% books in translation. It had been 9% in 2022, and I said I wanted to try and read books by authors from 25 different countries. I read from 21 countries in 2022. So I have done okay on these goals. I haven't quite met those targets, but I've got closer than I had in previous years. So I read 12% in translation in 2023, which is, you know, less than 15%, but is more than 9%. So that's kind of getting in the right direction. And then I read from 23 different countries in 2023, which isn't 25, but is fairly close and is more than 21. So, you know, I'm going in the right direction. This goal will basically stay on my list for 2024. And then finally, we move on to the big event of my goals, which is my crazy goals reading spreadsheet. I love this spreadsheet. I feel like some people would find this kind of insane goal spreadsheet stressful, but personally I just really, really love it. I'll put this up on the screen so you can see it properly, and we're going to go through it like section by section as well. I think I did pretty well with my reading goal spreadsheet in 2023. There are a lot of ticks, there are a few gaps, more gaps in some sections than others, but overall I did pretty well. So I ticked off 208 squares of my 238 squares, which I'm pretty happy with. I only have 30 blank squares, which means I completed 87% of my goals for 2023, which I'm pretty happy with. I think that's pretty good. You know, this is always like a fun checklist to make sure I'm reading a variety of things rather than ever being something I'm intending to tick off in full. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's pretty good. So let me take you through each category in turn, and we'll start off at the top with the classics, and specifically with the Victorian classics. So as you can see, I have a few different categories here. So I had 7 boxes for my Dickens rereads, books I'm reading for the Mega Dickens read along, and I ticked off all 7. I had 5 boxes for other Victorian rereads. I ticked off 4. That's fine. To be honest, this box was there less because I wanted to reread 5 Victorian books in 2023 and more because I didn't want the rereads to count to like the rest of my Victorian goal. Like I wanted to separate them, if that makes sense. I also have 5 boxes for books by Anthony Trollope in 2023, and I only read 3 rather than 5 Anthony Trollope books in 2023, which I am disappointed by, especially considering that all 3 of the books by Anthony Trollope I read this year were in my favourite books of 2023. I think that tells me I should have read more books by Anthony Trollope in 2023. I should say I did actually read 4 books by Anthony Trollope in 2023, but one was a reread, so it went in the reread category rather than in the Anthony Trollope category. The point of that Anthony Trollope category is to read new Anthony Trollope books, not to reread Anthony Trollope books, because I have now, I think, read 34 out of his 47 novels, and I've got 13 left, and I need to get cracking because I love Anthony Trollope and I do want to read all his books at some point quite soon, because I want to do a massive ranking video and it'll be really fun and really long. And then I have, I think, 19 squares for other Victorian books, and I read 20, so I read 1 extra and ticked off all of those squares, which is lovely because I love Victorian literature and I like to read a lot, so I'm very, very happy with that. And then my next category, moving one down, is for British classics that aren't from the Victorian period. So in the 1900 to 1950 section, I had 10 boxes, and I think I read 13 books from 1900 to 1950. I said 13 here, that's what I've got written down. I feel like I said 12 earlier. Occasionally I feel like my stats don't quite align and I don't know what's happened. It's definitely more than 10 anyway, so happy with that. I had 8 boxes to tick off for British literature from before 1837, and I read 10, so that's great. Then I didn't do so well on my books from 1950 to 1990. I had 5 boxes and I only ticked off 2. That wasn't an especially important goal for me, so I don't mind too much that there are spaces there. Then moving on to my international classics, my classics from countries other than Britain. I wanted to read 4 classics from each of India, Italy and Jamaica. Those were the 3 main countries on my international classics goal this year, and I did indeed read 4 classics from those 3 countries, so I'm really pleased with that. I read 1 rather than 2 Brazilian classics and 1 rather than 2 French classics, which is fine. I didn't read any Chinese classics this year, which is a shame. I have volumes 2 and 3 of Story of a Stone. I read volume 1 in 2022, and I did really want to read at least volume 2 in 2023, but I didn't manage to, but hopefully I will in 2024, we'll see. And then I also had 7 boxes for reading other classics from other countries in the world, and I ended up reading 9 classics from other countries in the world, so I'm pretty happy with that. Overall, I did read quite a lot of international classics in 2023. Then moving down to the modern section, first we have historical fiction. I gave myself 24 boxes to tick off in 2023, and I read 33 works of historical fiction this year, so that is well over 24. I feel like this category should probably have more boxes next year because, let's face it, I love historical fiction and I want to read a lot of it, and that's good. I also think probably because my own novel, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, was coming out this year, I was therefore like all the more tuned in to like new releases in 2023 of historical fiction, so I read a lot of new release historical fiction in 2023, which I really enjoyed, so I'm very happy that I went well overboard on this goal. That's fine for me. Then moving down to the next category, which was for a few other genres of modern fiction, I had 7 boxes for rom-coms or commercial women's fiction, and I ticked off all of those. I had 7 boxes for sci-fi and fantasy, and I ticked off 1, which isn't so great really, is it? I have done pretty poorly on reading sci-fi and fantasy books in 2023. The only sci-fi or fantasy book I read in 2023 was Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson, which I did really enjoy, but I didn't read any other sci-fi and fantasy this year, which is a real shame. So that's definitely the goal that is like a complete fail of 2023. and I'm sad because I do really enjoy sci-fi and fantasy, and I don't know why I only read one this year. And then my other category, which is I guess mostly literary fiction with a bit of crime, I had 10 boxes to tick off and I ticked off 8, so you know, that's kind of fine, that's nearly there, I'll take that. Moving down to the next category is my kind of modern literature not from Britain, books from around the world. I said I wanted to read 7 Japanese books in 2023 and I read 5. I'm not too displeased with that, especially because I did read a few Japanese classics which went into the other category of my non-British classics above. I think I probably read 8 books from Japan in 2023, but 5 of them were modern and 3 of them were classics, so I'm relatively happy with that. I have 7 boxes for the USA, and I read 11 books from the USA, which again is slightly over, and that's fine. I mostly have US as a separate category so that my other category isn't just taken up with lots of books from the US, and then in my other category I have 15 slots for books from other places in the world, and I read 13. So I didn't quite tick off that goal in full, but I did pretty well, so I am relatively happy with that. And then moving down to the next category, which was my 2023 new releases. So I said that I wanted to read 20 new releases from 2023 in the year of 2023, partly because, as I said, my own novel was coming out in 2023. I was really clued into lots of the other debuts coming out this year, and I had got to talking to a lot of other people who had books coming out this year on Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that, so I wanted to try and read lots of their books and support them. So I had 20 boxes and I ticked off 18, so I'm pretty happy with that. That's not too bad, that's nearly complete. Finally, moving on to my last 2 general categories. My first is my not novel category, and here I read well over a lot of my categories. So I said I wanted to read 5 plays in 2023 and I read 15. I said I wanted to read 10 short story collections and I read 12 short story collections and quite a lot more individual short stories. And I said I wanted to read 8 poetry collections and I read 16. And then I said I wanted to read 10 works of non-fiction and I read 11. So I definitely read a lot more than I planned, especially on the plays and the poetry, which was really nice. And this is partly because, as I mentioned a couple of times on this channel, I'm now in a book club where every month we read 1 play, 1 work of poetry, and 1 short story, which is really nice and definitely widens my reading to different forms in a way that I really enjoy. And I love reading plays. I have had such a good time, especially with the plays this year, so that's been really nice. And then finally we have my TBR jar pit goal, which I failed at quite badly. I said I wanted to read 24 books from my little TBR jar, and as I mentioned earlier, I did actually want to read more than 24 books from this jar, because I wanted to try and empty it more, and I have ticked off 18 out of those 24 boxes, which is not so good, especially considering how very full my TBR jar is, and I still haven't added in all the rest of the books. So currently it's just the books that I have owned since before Christmas 2022, and I'm going to add in all the rest of the books that I have owned since before Christmas 2023 into this jar, and then we'll see how far I can get through it this year. So overall, I'm pretty pleased with my goals spreadsheet progress. I feel like basically the only 2 goals I failed, as far as I'm concerned, are my sci-fi fantasy goal and my TBR jar pit goal. And if those are the only goals that I'm failing, then, you know, that's not too bad. Overall, I'm still pretty happy with my progress through my mega goals spreadsheet in 2023. And I've already put together my mega goals spreadsheet for 2024, which I've had lots of fun putting together. So that's how I've done with my 2023 reading goals. In general, mediumly, although my TBR is definitely out of control, and that's going to be a big focus for 2024. Otherwise, I think that's all I have to say for today. So do let me know down in the comments if you have any thoughts about my reading stats or my reading goals. Do let me know how your reading goals for 2023 went, if you had any. And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.